responsibility to protect is the set of principles that were unanimously agreed by the UN General Assembly in 2005 with three basic messages. States have a responsibility to their own people not to commit or allow to be committed crimes like genocide and other crimes against humanity and major war crimes. Secondly, other states in the international community have a responsibility to assist those states in meeting their responsibility to their own people. And thirdly, probably most importantly and most relevantly to Myanmar, when a state is manifestly failing to meet its responsibilities to its own people, not to commit genocide or mass atrocity crimes or allow them to be committed, then the wider international community has a responsibility to take appropriate action, including, in a very extreme case, military action, provided it has the support of the Security Council. But the responsibility to protect is a whole range of principles, preventive and reactive, that are highly relevant to the situation as it has so distressingly unfolded in Myanmar. And at the moment, I think what people can most realistically hope for in calling for the application of responsibility to protect, or R2P principles, to Myanmar is for the international community, led by the UN Security Council, hopefully, to take appropriately strong action now. And that action, realistically, probably does not include military action. There's a whole variety of reasons for that. There's an absence of any obvious willingness by any country to engage militarily. There's always huge risks that military intervention will cause even more havoc and misery than the bad behavior of the government inside the country. And you always have to be conscious that you don't cause more harm than you are avoiding. So military action is really going to be very difficult. And of course, it'll be very difficult to get agreement on the Security Council with China and particularly Russia behaving as they are. But there are lots of other strong actions that the international community can take, lots of strong actions that the United Nations Security Council can take. They include not only strong condemnations, but agreement on targeted sanctions, agreement on an arms embargo, agreement on referring those who are perpetrating these crimes to the International Criminal Court for prosecution. So there's a lot of important messages that can be sent, a lot of important pressures that can be put upon a country that is breaching its responsibility to protect. And I hope very much personally, as one of those who is responsible for developing the idea of the responsibility to protect and getting it agreed unanimously in 2005, I very much hope that that responsibility will be exercised now by the international community. I know that there are many, many people in Myanmar crying out for the recognition of this as an R2P case and crying out for strong international action. And the time is overdue now for that international action to be delivered. The Burmese military, the Tatmadaw, have a very clear responsibility under the responsibility to protect R2P principles, not to perpetrate violence against their own people, certainly not in a form which amounts to crimes against humanity, as the shooting, the killing of unarmed demonstrators unquestionably does. The United Nations Security Council was very clear about that back in 2011, when the government of Libya, the military of Libya under Colonel Gaddafi, was also engaged in one-sided horrible violence against its own people who were protesting peacefully about the erosion of democratic rights. So we have a clear precedent for a very strong message being given to the military by the international community that it is in breach not only of ordinary principles of decency, but it's in breach of international law. And there will be consequences for that because of the operation of the International Criminal Court and the rules that exist out there. condemning and punishing this kind of behavior. Of course, it's difficult to get the generals in Myanmar or anywhere else before an international court. It requires a lot of international cooperation. It will require an initiative by the UN Security Council for that to happen. And the UN Security Council is meeting today as we're talking. I hope very much that we will see some strong action of this kind taking place. But the message from the international community could not be clearer in principle. The generals are taking a huge risk by behaving grotesquely as they are and perpetrating this violence against their own people. They cannot hope to emerge from this with any credibility whatsoever. The only hope is that they will appreciate that there's no way they can go on doing what they're doing. They'll have to return to kind of democratic constitution with all its imperfections that Myanmar had developed, and recognize that this kind of behavior is not only never going to be forgiven or forgotten internally, but it won't be forgiven or forgotten by the wider international community. And there'll be real consequences for those generals who want military cooperation with other countries, who want to travel to other countries, who want to educate their children in other countries. The world, whether it's through collectively the UN Security Council or whether it's individual countries, the world will react very, very strongly to what is happening so tragically in Myanmar at the moment. If the catastrophe in Myanmar is to stop and further horrendous violence is to be avoided, a number of things, a number of players have to play an active role. It is crucial, of course, that the people who've shown such extraordinary courage in the streets continue to make their voices clearly heard, and that the generals get the message that the country is simply going to be ungovernable, quite apart from anything else, if they continue with the present terrible violence. So it's very difficult from outside to say everything depends on the people maintaining their extraordinary courage in the streets, but that probably is a precondition of this situation moving in a better direction. The second thing that has to happen is for the neighbouring countries, Myanmar's ASEAN neighbours, to get serious about recognising the terrible damage that's being done to the ASEAN brand by the behaviour of the generals, and putting some really, really strong political pressure on the Myanmar government. Indonesia is trying very hard to do that at the moment, with some support from Singapore, a little bit from Vietnam, one or two of the others. But ASEAN collectively is not behaving very responsibly at all at the moment. And it's critical that it does. Myanmar has shown in the past, the generals have shown in the past, that they are sensitive to that pressure coming from their own neighbours, and we're just not seeing it. Further responsibility has to be exercised by the wider international community generally to do everything in its power to put pressure on the generals. By itself, that may not be decisive, but it's crucial that the message continue to be sent. And the most important messages are the application of targeted sanctions, not against the whole economy, not against ordinary people, but against the generals themselves, financial sanctions, travel sanctions, sanctions on the education of their kids overseas. There should be arms embargoes, of course, no more arms going in. There should be a clear threat of prosecution and a reference to the International Criminal Court, so that we don't have a sense of impunity if they continue perpetrating these crimes at the leadership level. There's also a particular responsibility, of course, on China and Russia, both because of the pivotal role they play in the Security Council. If they veto the application of sanctions or the application of embargoes or a reference to the criminal court, it simply can't happen through that channel. So their role is important. China is obviously unhappy with the generals, doesn't want them to go on behaving as stupidly and viciously as they have. But where it will exercise that power that it has as a very, very important neighbour to persuade the generals to change course completely remains to be seen. Russia is an even more difficult case because Russia is just playing its usual spoiling role at the moment, without any sense of responsibility at all and without any problems at all in terms of a neighbour blowing up. So the problem with Russia is quite serious, and that's why we are going to be struggling to get traction in the Security Council. But overarching all of this is the absolute importance of that principle of the responsibility to protect, which was unanimously agreed by the world's countries, 190 of them, meeting at the General Assembly at head of state, at head of government level, responsibility to protect the world's peoples from genocide and mass atrocity crimes of the kind that we're seeing in Myanmar. And it is absolutely crucial that the way the voice of the people is being heard on this issue at the moment, with all the placards that are going up, the signs that are going up, the photos that are trickling out to the wider world. Clearly, R2P is relevant. Clearly, it is important. Clearly, it's motivating the people internally in Myanmar, and it should be something that really has an impact on the wider international community, the Secretary General, and the UN Security Council in particular. So on all these levels, there is an obligation, there's responsibility to keep on acting, to keep on placing such pressure as all of us can on these people to change course. The statement by the 12 Defence Force chiefs is an incredibly important message to be sending to the Myanmar generals. They don't have much respect for decency. They don't have much respect for principles of international law. That's clear. But they do have respect as military men for their peers, and they will be feeling very uncomfortable indeed at this pressure being put upon them. If the hope is that this is a sign that the wider international community or some key countries within it are now willing to take military action, aggressive military action, intervening military action against Myanmar, I think that hope is probably misplaced. I just don't see the will as being there to send in the Marines by any country at the moment. And there are very real questions about the legality of doing so if you cannot get UN Security Council agreement for that course of action. And there are always, as I said before, prudential reasons, considerations that have to be taken into account, because very often, as we've seen in so many countries around the world over so many decades, very often military action can in fact be counterproductive, causing more harm, more misery than it's actually avoiding. So the idea of a military invasion of Myanmar to stop the terrible rot that's occurring is probably something that's not going to happen. It is an available weapon under the R2P principle, but only if the Security Council agrees. I think what Professor Blaxland also had in mind was the idea of some kind of peacekeeping force that was sent in there by the UN Security Council in the context of the Cambodia peace settlement back in the late 80s, early 90s. Again, that presupposes that there is a peace to keep, that the generals are sort of agreeing to step back from what they're doing, and that the international community is willing to cooperate with them in sending in some kind of stabilizing force. I don't think there are real parallels between the Myanmar case and the Cambodia case. I think the bottom line is what's important about the general's statement is where I began. What is important is the message it sends that the Tatmadaws military peers, the people it really does respect, the only people it respects around the world, are very, very upset indeed, very, very strong in their condemnation of the behavior that the Tatmadaw is currently engaged in. And that is a very, very important message to send.